share your presentation, start your video, and start talking.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Our topic for today's presentation is finding the probability distribution of a pebble game using the Monte Carlo method. Now, first I'll briefly explain to you what this pebble game is about. So, in this place called Monte Carlo in Monaco, this game was played by people of all age groups. So the children played it on beaches in a 3x3 grid. They made a square and inside that a circle, and they throwed a pebble around. And the adults played it on helipods, and they played it in 30x30 grids. And by studying that game, today we will learn about important aspects of sampling.
So what exactly is the Monte Carlo method? When we talk about the Monte Carlo method, it is a broad classification of computational algorithms that entail the stochastic evaluation of physical quantities that by using random numbers. And it involves it involves repeated random sampling. So the Monte Carlo method includes both direct chain sampling or just simply direct sampling and Markov chain sampling.
So the first instance we take into consideration is the, am I audible? Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
you are audible.
so the first instance that we take into consideration is direct sampling. Now, to gain a basic understanding of how this works, we'll consider a diagram of the square and the circle, as I told before. And the circle is drawn inside the square. So suppose in order to imitate a data set of values to be sampled from, we use pebbles. Now these pebbles are thrown at random into the square. Each pebble inside the square is counted as a trial, and each pebble that falls inside a circle is counted as a hit. Using this, we can calculate the value of pi from the ratio of the area of circle to the area of the square. And this will be equal to pi upon 4. So suppose, for example, we take 4,000 pebbles as trials. And we can take a random number like 3,156 hits. So from that, uh, so this is the ratio, and this would be equal to pi by 4. So from here, if we calculate the value of pi, we get it as 3.156, which is not the exact value, but if we consider an infinite number of pebbles, the value of pi could be computed.
So though the same diagram can be used to explain Markov chain sampling, it's best explained using this grid here, which is a 3x3 grid. So starting in the upper right corner, we suppose a pebble is thrown in a random direction. We then move to the site at which that pebble has landed, pull out a new pebble, and throw it in another direction at random again. The aim being, as before, to evenly sweep out the entire area. However, the difference here lies in how we treat the pebbles that land outside the grid. Instead of simply continuing or moving outside the grid, we retrieve the pebble, place it on top of the one already present on that site, and then throw a new one. Eventually, we move on, and if, of course, we happen to throw it outside the grid again, we repeat that entire process. But at some point, we do arrive at the center of the grid, which is when we have no rejected moves. So it leaves us with only single stones at the center of the pad or the center of the grid. Close to the boundaries, however, and especially at the corners, there are piles of pebbles that correspond to rejected moves. Now, to understand what exactly the Markov chain algorithm is all about, let's look at a simplified version of the Pebble game. So here we have 3 grids, starting with the one in the middle. We start at the upper right corner. Now, there are 4 directions that the pebble can be thrown in. That's up, right, left, and down. If it's thrown up or to the right, those moves are rejected and the pebble stays at side A. But if it's thrown to the left, we move to side B, and if it's thrown down, we move to side C. Now, the transition probabilities for these sides are given below their respective grids. For side B, it's P of A to B. For side A, it's P of A to A. And for side C, it's P of A to C. Now, to find the probability of the pebble to be at configuration at site A, that's pi A, we have the formula pi A into the transition probability of A to A plus the probability of the pebble to be at site B into the transition probability B to A plus the probability of the pebble to be at site C into the transition probability C to A. The one here is the summation of all of these transition probabilities, which, as we all know, has to be 1. So when we substitute this value into the first equation, where we've written pi of A into 1, and by multiplying and then canceling out the common terms, we get this. This is what is called the global balance condition, which is a necessary condition for the Monte Carlo algorithm. However, it can be further simplified by separately considering the transition probabilities from A to B or B to A, and A to C and C to A. This is the delicate balance condition. So what our Monte Carlo algorithm basically is, it's nothing but this set of transition probabilities from one side to another that has to satisfy the global balance condition. So what does the detailed balance condition mean though? What we want is to have pi of A equals pi of B equals pi of C, and so on and so forth as we have more and more moves. This implies that we need to have the probabilities P A to B equal to P B to A, and P A to C equal to P C to A. Now, how are we supposed to implement this? That's very simple. By moving from any configuration with the probability 1/4 to the right, up, left, and down. So all of these moves, all of these allowed moves, have the probability 1/4, which is a fairly simple solution, and it also involves rejections. Like, as I mentioned earlier, if we're at site A, we reject the moves to the right and up. So we have a probability of half of staying at site A. The probability to move from A to B or from A to C remains 1/4. So at configuration B, we have a rejection probability of 1/4, that is up. And on site C, we also have a rejection probability of 1/4 to the right. So this is the basis of the celebrated Metropolis algorithm, which is what the Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm actually is.
Now, coming to the aim of this experiment, what are we actually trying to do here? So we're trying to design the Pebble game as a 2D grid, and after a large number of runs or a large, a sufficient amount of time, a large number of trials, we are trying to sweep the entire grid by supposedly throwing the pebble around, and we are trying to prove here that the probability of the pebble being in any of the blocks of the grid is equal.
So we've written two codes for this experiment. One is for a 3x3 grid and one is for a 30x30 grid. So what's gone into our program is first we're importing all the modules that we need, and then we have the x vectors and y vector position that will help us decide what position we're trying to get to. And so neighbor is a list that contains multiple lists consisting of positions. So as you can see, for the very first one, it says 1, 2, 4, 1, 1, which implies that it's a corner position, and therefore the pebble can only move in two directions. After that, we have a list vector that is empty for now and will be used to store all the positions that we end up reaching on during the several iterations of the program. Initially, we'd set the number of runs to quite a few different values, and in this case, we've left it at 10. Once we've run through all of these iterations, that is, we've done it 100,000 times, and we've appended all of those positions to the list vector. We pick out the positions from the x vector and y vector lists, and we plot histograms using those positions. We've done the same thing for the 30x30 grid. However, it was a little more complex. So instead of making the lists outright, we sort of used loops to do it, but the basic concept remains the same.
Now, coming to the histograms, we ran these programs, the codes, and these were the histograms that we got for the 3x3 grid. So here T indicates the number of trials. So in the first one, with the number of trials equal to 0, that is, the pebble remains in the initial site itself. Here we can see by the color coding beside the histogram, which indicates the probability of the pebble being in a particular site. So since it stayed in the initial site, the probability for the pebble to be in that one site equals 1. And since it did not move into the other sites, that automatically becomes 0. The probability for the other sites becomes 0. Then in the next one, T is equal to 1. So beginning from the top right corner, it can move only once in any of the 4 directions. Now, it can move in the upward or downward direction or left or right. But since it's the upward and the right directions will be considered as rejected moves, so for those 2 moves, it will stay in its initial position only. And for the other 2, it can move. That those moves will be allowed. So if we study the probability for just one move, for T is equal to 1, then for the first, for the initial position, it will be 1/2 because it has the probability for the other 2 positions as well. And for the left and the downward move, it has 1/4 probabilities. Now coming to the next one is T/10. So here we can observe like similarly only it gets 10 moves this time. But here one thing that we can note is that the number of trials, the more the number of trials, the more uniformity in the probability we see. So that is the thing that we're trying to study over here, that after a sufficient amount of time or after a sufficient number of trials, we get that the probability for the pebble being in each of the sites is equal. Next. Okay,
So-
sorry. I'm sorry, I missed that one. Yeah. So coming to the 30 by 30 grids, now the histograms that we observe here also are similar to the ones that we observed in the 3 by 3 ones. It's just that the
Yeah.
number of samples we
You have 1 minute more.
yes. So it's just that the number of samples we have here are more, and also that the uniformity in probability is also same. Next.
So with this, we prove that the higher the number of runs, the more the amount of time, the more uniform the probability distribution becomes. Or to put it simply, the Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation calculations converge to equilibrium after an infinite amount of or an infinite number of iterations.
Now, the main application, the one that we haven't mentioned here, is that the Monte Carlo simulation was originally designed for for the study of nuclear weapons and their functioning. Like it was to simulate their working as to observe the uncertainties that can happen during the process. And other than that, we have the mentioned applications as well.
Okay, so now we open for question and answers.
I'll start, Anvesh.
Did you have any particular application in mind?
Sorry?
Did you have any particular application in mind? I mean, why did you, you did this just to understand the sampling, or you had some particular application in mind?
So we were trying to prove the equiprobability theorem to gain a better understanding of that and how it works when it comes to statistical mechanics.
It was mainly to study this theorem because it was just introduced as to like during the last semester. But along with studying this, we also studied about applications. So while we began with the project, we didn't really have any particular application in mind.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Dr. Modi, you can ask.
Yeah, you said statistical mechanics. So tell me, where will we use in statistical mechanics? Am I audible? Hello?
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I'm asking, you said statistical mechanics. So where would you use it in statistical mechanics?
I think it would be the Ising model. If we had to be specific, yeah.
You know about Ising model?
We don't exactly know what it is. We don't know about it in detail, but
why don't we go to your yeah. Let's go to your slide of go back. Can you just show the slide?
Yes, sir. Just a second. Which slide do we go to, sir?
Yeah, when you open, I will. Next. Probably the last one, where you had those three squares with different colors.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. There was something else written below this also. Is this the next slide or this slide?
I guess it's the next slide.
Is it this one?
Yeah, can we just go to the previous slide for a minute?
Yeah.
Now see, in 10 moves, you have shown equal probability for all the 9. I did not
No, it's
understand
not
that.
exactly
I understood
equal
the
probability.
second slide. Second slide you said I understood this. Here I
Yes,
did
sir.
not understand that how in 10 moves you have all the ones filled with equal probability.
No, sir, it's not at 10 moves. It's actually a very subtle difference in color, but
Like if you can zoom in a little bit.
I don't think I can. Oh, I can.
Okay,
It's a
I
I
very
see
subtle
some,
color difference.
yeah,
Yes, sir.
little
So then,
shading I can see.
So it's only when it goes to say t is equal to 100 that it becomes a square like of one color.
Okay.
Essentially.
Can we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here I didn't understand. You are showing number of moves to be 0 to 10 and then 30 by 30 grid. And
yes, sir.
again,
Yes,
here,
yes.
is there a shading difference, or I don't know what
So
No, sir.
in the first one, actually, since the number of trials is 0, so the pebble actually remains in the initial site only. So
yeah, there's a small square
yes, sir,
at
that's
that
a small white square. So the probability to be in that square becomes 1, and the
and then
rest of
small
them
orange
becomes 0.
and yeah.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
But in
And
10,
the
of course,
next
Again,
one,
you yeah, you
in
probably
10
are trying
again,
to
there's
say
a
that
very
there are
subtle
shading.
difference.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine,
but
fine, fine.
yes, sir.
unfortunately, it doesn't spread to the entire thing because
Yeah,
it's a
I know.
massive grid.
Don't
We're
worry, don't
running
worry.
it
This is fine.
100,000 times.
This is fine. The program you showed, did you develop it, or it is just a standard routine available?
No, sir, we
No, sir.
developed it.
You developed it.
Yes, sir.
And so this coding you are showing is with that program.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So you did not run for more than 10 trials.
So we can.
did. We did it. We also did it for t is equal to 100 for the 3x3 grid, and but we didn't add that in because we just wanted to show how it varies within small instances of time.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Any other question from anybody? If not, then thank you, Mahima and Ruru. We can now go to group number 9.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Rajesh,
Yes.
Rajesh,
Yes, sir.
just I need 2 minutes break because there is no electric supply. I need to just go and open it for me.
Okay.
Can you give me 2
You
minutes? Then I'll join. Just 2 minutes.
much?
I'll just go and open some
Yeah.
shutters, basically.
Yeah. Okay.
So let students start after 2 minutes. That's all I'm saying.
Let them come and share the screen in the meet. So I invite
Yeah.
group
But
number.
let them start only. Yeah.
Yeah. We will wait, sir. Group number 9, Yash and Shajev.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Please come.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Please try to put your videos on and share your screen presentation.
Can you all see my screen?
Yeah. We can see your screen. Yeah. We'll just wait for the sir to come and then you can start your explanation.
Yes, sir. Sure. Okay, sir.
Yeah, sorry, I'm ready.
Yeah. Okay. You can start. Your time starts now, Shajid and Yash.
Yes, sir, sure. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shazib, and my partner is Yash, and our topic for the day is stable isobars. Now, as we all know, that everything around us is made up of atoms, which are the fundamental units of matter. The atom itself is composed of various subatomic particles such as protons, neutrons, electrons, etc. The positively charged proton and the neutral neutrons form the nucleus of the atom, whereas the negatively charged electrons they revolve around the nucleus. Sorry. And also there are certain elements in nature which have the same atomic mass number but different atomic number. These elements are known as isobars. So our aim of this project was to find the most stable isobar in a given isobaric family.
So now the question is how to find the most stable isobar. So the first method is we the first method is by observing the spontaneous decay chain reaction of any required isobaric family, and then with the help of experimental data of binding energy, we plot the mass parabola. The second method is a theoretical approach when where we make the use of semi-empirical mass formula, which is nothing but the Bethe-Weizsäcker's equation.
Yeah. So let's understand the first method, that is the mass parabola. So in mass parabola method, we are plotting the binding energy of the nuclides against their atomic number. Now, these mass parabolas, they fall in two categories according to their mass number, whether their mass number is odd or even. Also, the point of minima in these mass parabolas, they give us the most stable isobar.
So this is the Bethe-Weizsäcker's equation. The important application of this equation is when we derivate this above equation with respect to z, and when we equate it to 0, we get this equation. Now, what is this equation? This equation tells us about the atomic number of the most stable isobar in that mass parabola.
Now, how does the nuclear achieve stability? And the answer for that is radioactive decay. So let's have a look at this reaction. So we have an element carbon 14. Now this carbon 14 element has a excessive number of neutron. So it what happens is basically it the one of the neutrons will get converted to a proton, and we will get nitrogen 14, and an antineutrino and an electron will be emitted. This decay reaction is known as beta minus decay.
Now let's see another reaction. Here we have carbon 10. Now, as you can see that carbon 10, there are more number of protons than there are neutrons. So what will happen? In order to achieve stability, the one proton will get converted into one neutron, and it will get converted into a boron 10 nuclei. But during this process, a neutrino here and a positron will be emitted. This type of reaction is called as the beta plus decay.
Okay. Yeah. So here we have we have used the first method, and that is the mass parabola. So we have plotted an odd nuclide. Now to explain it in a more interactive way, uh, yes, can you go to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So to explain it in a more interactive way, I would like either of the judges to tell any odd number from 1 to 250, between 1 to 250. Can any one of the judge please tell a number?
137.
137. Okay, so this 137 is actually the mass number, so we are entering the 137. Yeah, so this, when we run this, so we get the mass parabola. And also from the mass parabola, yeah, can you go to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
mass
I'll
parabola
open.
which we have saved? Yeah.
Yeah, just a second. So
Yeah, so this is a mass parabola that we have got just now for atomic mass number equal to 137. So from this mass parabola, we can see that the minimum point in this parabola gives us the most stable nuclide, and that is, which in this case is barium. Also, I would like to explain this mass parabola. So the elements which are on the either side, okay, for example, in this case, which are tin and yeah, So these elements, they are the unstable one, and they will undergo decay reaction. The elements which are on the left hand side of the parabola, they actually have a lower atomic number value, so they have more number of neutron. So these elements on the left hand side, they will undergo beta minus decay. And on the elements which are on the right hand side of the parabola, so they have a higher Z value, that is their atomic number is more, so they have more number of proton, and therefore they will undergo the electron capture reaction or the beta plus decay. Yeah.
So now can you tell an even number?
172.
172. Okay, so I'll open it in. Okay, so for 172, what we see is that as we saw in the odd one, there was only a one mass parabola, right? And even for an even mass number, we have two mass parabolas, and since we have two mass parabolas, we get two most stable. The MNS stands for the most stable nuclei. So for even one, we get two most stable nuclei. So in this case, for 172, we have terbium and I have to see which one was that. So it prints the name over here as well. So it is terbium and thulium in for 172. This is for the easy. That's it.
So here we have compared the two methods that we have used. So for 101 mass number, the most stable nuclei that we get from the mass parabola is ruthenium 44, and from the theoretical value from the that Bethe-Weizsäcker equation, we get the value of ZAS 43.435 for 101, and similarly for 102, which is an even mass number, we get two different most stable nuclei. One is rhodium 45 and other is ruthenium 44, and that again the theoretical value is 43.825. So you can see that both the methods, they are in agreement with each other, they are almost the same.
Okay. So the second plot is the plot of the atomic number of the most stable nuclide or isobar, we can say, against its atomic mass. So the significance of this graph is that it tells us the dependency of atomic number versus the atomic mass. The second is that after if we can try to extrapolate this graph, we then can also predict the atomic number for the most stable isobar for any given mass number. So applications.
Yeah, so let's see the application. So for the first method, that is a mass parabola, one of the application that we just seen now was to find the stable isobar for any isobaric family. So we get the stable isobar, and the second application is this: it also explains the stability of the nucleus, why that given nuclide is a stable one.
So the second method that we used was the Bethe-Weizsäcker's equation. So the first application of this equation is that we can find the atomic number for the most stable isobar that we did theoretically calculate. Second is like we can also find out the binding energy for any nucleus if we put the value of Zn in that equation. So the results and conclusion of our project is, the first point is that if you see the mass parabola, we saw that the most stable one was at the bottom and it had the highest binding energy. If you can see the y-axis, you will see that the binding energy was the highest. The second point is that, yeah, in the odd mass parabola, we saw that there was only one mass parabola and it had only one stable nuclei. But in the even one, it had two mass parabolas, and therefore it also had two most stable isobars. And the third point is that, that comparison that we did, the nucleides that were representing the most stable isobars, they were almost the same, theoretically, as well as what we got from the mass parabola. Thank you.
We now open up for question and answer.
Maybe, I mean, you explained it at the beginning, perhaps I missed. Can you just show me once more how you obtained these parabolas?
Yes, for sure.
So which slide? The starting one you're talking about? So the way we obtained it, like we took the binding energy data from a nuclear data site, and then we saw first how the spontaneous reaction is happening of that beta decay chain. So we saw for example, in atomic mass number 15, we see that carbon is getting decaying into nitrogen and further on. So we first see the chain reaction, and then we simultaneously note down the binding energy of each nuclei, and that is how we plot the mass parabola.
So for each
For each mass number, you have to calculate.
yeah, so basically for each nucleus, you obtain the binding energy from some table,
Yeah.
is it?
Yeah. So
Yes, sir.
there was we have also mentioned it in the reference. So we used a nuclear data site which provided us the data for the binding energy, but the only thing that we had to do was to check the nuclear chain, the spontaneous nuclear chain.
And do you know how to calculate this binding energy?
Yes, sir. That can also be done theoretically by using the Bethe-Weiss equation.
Bethe-Weiss equation.
So I'll show this equation as well. So the first equation here, this one.
Okay, so then let me understand. So for each atom, rather for each nucleus, you first figured out what is the decay chain, and for those you obtained the binding energy from this database, and then you plotted it. Am I right?
Yes. And for us to check if that mass parabola is correct, we also did it theoretically by this Bethe-Weiss equation.
You mean you calculated the binding energy from this equation?
No, we don't calculate the binding energy, but we use one of its applications. So it also gave us the atomic number.
We calculated the atomic number value, the second from the second
Z,
equation.
we can see that if the Z is matching of the corresponding Z in the mass parabola.
So what are these? Where did you get these numbers? This AA and AC, and what are these numbers, and where did you get them?
So these are constants. So each term has its own significance. So if you see AV, this is the volume energy term. So this formula basically tells us how binding is. What is binding energy actually? If you try to calculate it theoretically. So AV is the volume energy term. AS is the surface energy term. AC is the Coulomb.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
But these are the values that you again obtained from somewhere, right?
So we are not using this equation, right? We are just using these constants. So this below equation.
Yeah. So my question is that what did you do with this second equation? You obtained this ZA. What is ZA?
So ZA is the atomic number.
It's the atomic number for the most stable layer.
Right. So that you checked that lies at the bottom of the parabola. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but I mean, if you have already obtained the chain, then you know that the last product will have this ZA. Am I right, or am I missing something?
Yes, sir. So, but suppose if we don't have the mass parabola, then this is one of the way that we can do it. So because so there are so many nucleides, right? For you don't sit and write down the binding energy of each. There are more than 2,000 nucleides present out there. So
yeah, and then what do you do? What do you do?
So we developed a Python code. So what it does is that goes into the site. It simultaneously checks the binding energy and it notes down in a data. So I'll show this data as well. So this is the Excel. This is the Excel data. So the Python code, what it does is that basically runs. It goes to the site. It notes down the binding energy and gives us in the Excel sheet. So
okay.
So you can see that. Not this one. Yeah, so this one. You can see that it's simultaneously noting down the binding energy. So we don't have to manually do it.
Sorry for being critical. What I'm asking is that, did I miss anything that, the impression that I form is that this is mostly a visualization tool of the binding energy. Am I right or am I missing something? There's more to it.
So like, what do you mean by visualization tool? I didn't get
You,
it.
you have a database.
Mhm.
You are providing a tool to visualize it.
Mhm. Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh, yeah, I'm going to reiterate the same question.
Mhm.
You have the database of binding energy. You're not calculating with your program.
No, sir. We can
No, sir.
calculate, but we are using the binding and nuclear data that we have.
You are using that formula only for finding Z for the most stable isotope.
Mhm.
But when I give you odd value, you got two stable. And
So
No,
for
sir. For
even,
two
for
even,
different
even,
parabola.
for even we get two stable.
for odd, we got only one.
For we have
Yeah,
one.
so if you have even, you get two parabolas. So
Mhm.
and then two parabolas will give you three stable isotopes.
In that case, the theoretical value will be in decimal. Yes, it has to be in decimal, but it will be approximately somewhere between that. Somewhere between those two values of the
So
ZA.
so the entire program that all it does is just calculates the Z for the stable nucleus and just maps it from the database. That's all.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I have
I'm
a
just trying
pedantic
to.
question. Is it a parabola?
The which one?
The curve that you showed,
Yeah.
you're calling it a parabola. Is it a parabola, strictly speaking?
Yes, sir, it is, because this number they are not even considering, because then the graph, what you can say, the diagram will be too big, because there are too many nucleides over this side, on this side, on the
No, that's all right.
left hand. Yeah.
But does this curve follow the equation, mathematical equation of a parabola?
Yes, sir, it does.
How do you know that and how do you justify that? Are you calling it
No, sir,
parabola
it does
just
not.
because it
It
looks
does
like a
not follow
parabola?
the actual parabola equation. It looks like a parabola.
Yeah, that's my guess. I mean,
Mhm.
it actually to me it does not even look like a parabola, but that's a name that you have given, right? It's not that it is actually a parabola.
It is not actually the mathematical parabola that we see, but it is somewhat represent that.
What is a non-mathematical parabola? Anyway, yeah.
Okay.
Purpose of your entire work was to just develop a code.
Mhm. Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
That
So,
would calculate
mhm.
Z for the stable isotope,
Mhm.
and it would access corresponding data from the database
Yeah. So we
and
don't have to like manually write down
and give you
everything.
a plot, right? The plot
Yes,
will
sir.
be created.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that was basically the aim of the entire exercise which you went through.
Mhm.
Or there was anything else you intended to?
No, just wanted to plot the mass parabola and check like if what will be the most stable isobar for any given mass number.
Okay. So this would be more like a coding for an app. So somebody can simply just punch an atomic weight and then it will get the parabola and Z value and so on. Okay,
Uh,
fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Yash and Shalir. Let's go to the next presentation. QIBSC Group 10, Vedansh and Rohan. Can you please share your presentation? I request all the remaining presenters to not to remove their shared screens unless the question and answer session is over. So, Vedansh and Rohan,
Am I
Yes,
audible, sir?
yes.
please go. Your time will start now.
So good afternoon, everyone. This is Vedansh Rashenkov here, and my partner is Rohan Gupta. So our title of the project is the variational principle for the hydrogen atom. So we did this project in our 5th semester in the course of atomic and molecular physics. So let's break the title into parts. So what is basically the variational principle? So in the field of quantum mechanics, the variational principle states basically that the ground state energy is always less than or equal to the expectation value of the Hamiltonian calculated with the trial wave function. So this method basically involves the finding by finding the approximation to the lowest energy eigenstate or the ground state. And so yeah, this method consists of choosing a trial wave functions, also known as ansatz wave functions. These ansatz wave functions are basically a more scientifically more fancier way of saying that it's a guess, just a more calculated guess of the wave function. So which are dependent on one or more parameters, and these parameters are further varied, and hence the name variational principle is proposed. So yeah, naturally based on the eigenvalue equation, which is h psi greater than or equal to E psi, but we find the energy expectation value in terms of the parameter using the equation h equals to t plus v, where t is the kinetic energy term and v is the potential energy term. So now here, when we have got the energy expectation value in terms of the parameter, and further, which is minimized with respect to that parameter, and which tells us the required value of that parameter. So further, this variational principle is solved on the basis of calculus of variation, which has a wider use in classical mechanics. Next, so why we choose the hydrogen atom? Since this hydrogen atom contains one electron and one proton, it makes us the simplest possible atoms to study. So since the hydrogen atom consists of one electron and one proton, so electron experiences Coulomb interactive forces, and the potential energy of the electron is expressed as U of r, which is shown here in the equation. Since this potential energy function does not depend on the time, hence it makes our job easier, as we can obtain the eigenvalues for the Hamiltonian by solving the time-independent Schrodinger equation. So next, so now, as we know that theoretically that the ground state energy of the electron is minus 13.6 electron volt, which will be further useful for our verification later on. So the ansatz wave function we chose here are the psi1, psi2, psi3, psi4 respectively. So here psi1 and psi3 are the exponentially damping wave functions, as we can see from the plots. And psi2 and the psi4 is the Gaussian wave function. As we know the lot about hydrogen atom, psi1 here shown is the exact wave function for the ground state of the hydrogen atom. Therefore, we will verify whether this wave function is correct or not. So, hand over to you.
So coming to the simulation code, the coding part which was done in Python, this is how it is. What initially we did was simply defining the constant, that is mass of the electron, charge of the electron, and h bar, that is h cross h upon 2 pi. This is z atomic number 1 for hydrogen atom. These are simply the empty arrays which are not very important right now. So for all the wave functions, what we did was we just have to define the wave function over here for all 4 of the wave functions, and then all the later calculation remains the same. Instead, just the wave function changes. So psi1, as was seen earlier, is given by this formula, and here the d is in the code we represented the d by b for some reason, but yeah, so it's this b or this d is actually the Bohr's radius, which since we already know that this wave function exactly represents the wave function for hydrogen atom in the ground state. So this atomic, so the Bohr's radius is given by h bar square upon zm e square. And yeah, so now we define the psi here, calculated the probability by squaring it, since it's not a complex function. Then we calculated the potential energy expectation by later on integrating, as the potential energy expectation is defined by this. Similarly, kinetic energy expectation is defined by this, and That also was calculated by integrating it after inputting in the formula. Then the total energy expectation, as we'll see, it was given by the sum of both of these values. So these are the energy expectation values obtained by in our output. So for the first wave function, the potential energy expectation value was this, kinetic was this, and total energy was this. So like we already know that in the ground state, the value of energy expectation, total energy, is minus 13.6 electron volts. But the theoretical value, as we have mentioned here, is not exactly that. That is because of the simple computational limits, because we were not able to put the very precise values of all the constants which were defined earlier. So we have done the verifications based on this value itself. So from our code, the value which we got was this. These are the kinetic and potential values. Similarly, for all four of the wave functions, this was done. And these are the ratios with respect to the first energy expectation value. And these are all less than 1. That means first energy value was the minimum. As you can see in this graph as well, the psi1 was just put here for a better visual representation. So psi1, as you can see, gives us the least value among all the four wave functions, and that means it corresponds like it represents the wave function which is very close to the ground state. And that is the thing about variational principle. We can only say that the wave function we have is more closer to the ground state. And the expectation energy which was obtained was minus 13.469, and it had an error associated with it of about 1% compared to the theoretical value. So now coming to the significance of this project. So a variational principle actually can be used in quantum mechanics for functions which have a Hamiltonian for whom the Schrodinger equation cannot be solved exactly, or like it's very complicated to solve. So that's where we can apply variational principle, because it requires simply uh, taking trial wave functions and putting it in the Hamiltonian and calculating the energy expectations. Like it involves a minimization of the parameters. That's why it's easier to do it. And it provides an alternative to the perturbation theory which we know of, because perturbation theory requires that the changes or the perturbations involved should be very less, and no such thing is a requirement when talking about the variational principle. And the last thing about variational principle I would like to say is that while like if you remember, we took a guess for those trial wave function. So we need a very excellent physical intuition if we want to get very close to the actual ground state wave function. For example, in this project for the hydrogen atom, we know that the potential energy is given by this, and it's inversely proportional to R simply. So we know that at R equals to infinity, we take the potential energy as 0. So the probability of finding the electron over there should also be minimum. And when we get closer to the nucleus, the probability of finding the electron should be increasing, because it's an attractive force that exists between the nucleus and the electron. So the probability of finding the electron, if I can put it in this way, it decreases as we go away from the nucleus.
You have
So
2 minutes more.
yeah, so it decreases as we go away from the nucleus. And we know that the wave function has to be a solution to the Schrodinger's equation, or to find the energy expectation for the Hamiltonian. So it requires to be a solution of a double differential equation. That's why the exponential term has been introduced here. So like could have been any other function as well, but the best guess would be an exponentially damping, and the parameter could be varied as R or R square, or like even this D could be varied. But after minimizing, we get the exact D, and that's how we come to the final wave function. So these are the references which were used during our project. And yeah, that's it.
Thank
Thank you.
We open for question and answer. Please keep your presentation shared. Don't remove it.
Can we go to your trial wave functions slide?
Okay, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure how is your Psi1 and Psi3 as you claim are different.
Sir, so D, what we chose was after minimization was equal to the Bohr's radius. That is like if I were to put the value 0.529 picometer, I think.
Angstrom.
Angstrom, yeah, sorry. So 0.529 angstrom. And here what we took Z is the same atomic number, that is 1. So like we're just trying out if there was a
No,
different
if you take Z as atomic number, you
Yeah.
have a dimensionality problem. So that is not how you would do.
Exactly. I was
So Psi1 and Psi3 technically are the same.
Yeah,
wave
like the
function.
functions are the same, exponentially damping.
You are not
No,
doing any.
Psi3 does not even make sense because the argument of the exponential function has to be dimensionless. So, so you have to scale the r by something, right?
Yes, sir. The Z is actually the distance only, just we took it as some different value. And the different value which we chose was equal to the atomic number.
Then what
It's
sir
not-
is saying, Psi1 and Psi3, there's only a normalization difference.
Yeah, it's only a normalization difference.
And if you have normalized the wave function properly, which you should have done anyway, then there is no difference. It is just a rewriting of the thing.
Yeah, if the actual
Actually, if you look at the
part of the
equation,
wave function is the same, it's almost the same.
No, not almost. If you just replace Z by 1 by D, you get
Yeah.
exactly Psi1 from Psi3.
Yeah.
And the same would be true between Psi2 and Psi4. And your curves also show the same thing. You
Yes,
look at
sir.
the graphs on the,
Yes, sir.
they just confirm that.
Yes, sir, I agree with that.
So, sorry, to interrupted you.
Yeah, please ask. Go ahead, Anvesh.
No, I was wondering that you have done it for the hydrogen atom. Have you tried it for any other hydrogen-like atom?
Yes, sir. Like, so we wanted to do the same, like apply the same method for helium atom as well, because it involves, like, if we ignore the part in the potential term of, that is 1 upon R1 minus R2, we can divide it into 2 hydrogen atoms, and then it could be solvable through the same variational method. But
Did you
when
try helium atom?
yeah, we
or you
wanted
tried
to try it,
iron?
but in Python, like, there was some computational error, and we had to drop that idea.
Okay.
We were not able to
What
figure
I'm
out
asking is that helium atom is more difficult. It is actually significantly more difficult, but helium ion you can try, singly ionized.
Okay, you mean hydrogen-like atoms,
right?
Okay. Yes, sir. To try that, sir. We'll try to.
Yeah.
Okay, any
So
other question?
yeah. I'm still there.
Yes, sir.
No. So when you did this calculation, as
Yes,
you
sir.
say, it's a variational method. So what was it that you are varying?
Sir, so ideally, the parameter that has to be varied comes either, like, we can take r or r square. So the power of r we can consider as one parameter. Second parameter could be the coefficient of r. So both of these parameters could be varied.
Did you vary them?
The r and r square, we have taken 2 different functions. So yeah, this parameter was varied. But like, as you pointed out, these 2 functions are the same. So then it comes out as
that's not called variation. Variation means you find the minimum value with respect to d.
Yes, sir.
So you are varying d, and trying to find out which D value will give you minimum.
Yes, sir.
Or like that
with
you,
respect to D.
yeah, like that you do with the Gaussian also.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how it is called variational method.
Yes, sir.
Fine, huh?
Okay, sir.
Yeah, and either in Psi2 or in Psi4, you must have made a normalization error, because if you put B equal to 1 by D square, then Psi2 and Psi4 should be identical, but the normalization constant is not. So just check somewhere.
Yeah, sir. I think it must have been an like simple input error because the calculations were correct.
Yeah, then yeah, okay. It may be that in the slide you have just missed it.
Yeah, input error only.
Okay, so we can stop here with this presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you, sir.
May I now invite group number 13, TYBSc, Tanay and Stephen. Can you please share your presentation?
Yes, sir.
And keep your video on.
Yes. Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes, yes, it's visible.
I'll start with my presentation.
Yeah, you start your time. Starts now.
Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon to all of you. So myself, Tanay Khona, I am from TYBSc, and I'm here with my project partner, Stephen Selvaraj, to show our work upon the topic efficiency of filters in frequency domain in the field of digital image processing. So first, I'll take you through the overview of this presentation. So we are basically trying to find the effectiveness and efficiency of various types of filters under frequency domain. So we have broadly divided this into two categories, that is high pass category and low pass category. And for each category, we are looking at ideal, Butterworth and Gaussian filters. And to support this, we have taken help of computational simulation to look at our results both quantitatively and qualitatively point of view. So the flow would be, I'll take you through the theory work and my partner will take you through the computational work and results. So let's start with the theory component. So first important thing in theory component is Fourier transform. To define it, we can say that any complex function can be shown as sum of its sine and cosine components. But here we are using Fourier transformation essentially to convert the image in its intensity plane to the frequency plane. So we can say that looking at efficiency of filtering in frequency domain, we can say that it is basically modifying the Fourier transform of the image as per our conditions and then taking inverse Fourier transform to see the change visually. The second important component is low pass filter. So what does low pass filter do? It is mainly effective on the images which has noise in the higher frequency region. To create this filter, we have given conditions for creating a circular region in which the radius of that circular region mainly symbolizes the cutoff frequency, which we have defined. So how it functions is all the frequency components which are lying inside that circle, it allows it to allows it to pass through, and all the components which are lying outside the circle, it attenuates it or cut off it. So here I have shown the transform function and the conditions for all the three types of filters we are looking at: ideal, Butterworth, and Gaussian. So here capital D U comma V is the distance of a pixel from the center. In the frequency domain, the center, the origin of the Fourier transform lies at the center. And H U comma V is the formula for the mask which we are defining, and it gives the condition whether to block that pixel or allow the pixel further. Same is for high pass filter. High pass filter is basically the opposite of low pass filter. So it is effective on the low noise which is there in the low frequency region of the image. And if we get condition for low pass filter, 1 minus that condition will essentially give us the condition for high pass filter. Anyways, in our code we have specified the condition for high pass filters also using the transform function and all. Now, to see over a result quantitatively, we need to see these two things. That is mean square error (MSE) and peak signal to noise ratio (PSNR). So the mean square error gives us the amount of noise which is still remaining after the filtering of that image. So it gives us that quantity through the equation which I have displayed over here. And peak signal to noise ratio, it is ratio of the highest peak in that signal. So we are using 8-bit image, that highest peak would be 255, and to the ratio of mean square error value which we have already obtained. Now over to you, Stephen. He'll take you through the computational part and resultant discussion.
So following is our flowchart of our program. So to start off, we take an input image, convert it into a grayscale 8-bit image, and add Gaussian noise to that image. Then we take the Fourier transform of that noise added image and define all the filters as a function using the formulas mentioned earlier. And thus we create mask. And we apply that mask to that Fourier transform of the noise added image and take its inverse transform to get the output. Then finally, we calculate the MSE and PSNR for each output. Next, please. So in the right side, we can see the original image, and the left side, we can see a noise-added image. In the noise-added image, there is a presence of a grainy texture, which indicates that the noise has been added successfully. Next. Following is the Fourier transform of the noise added image. In this, we can see that the brighter region, which is the low frequency values, are concentrated towards the origin, and the darker values, the high frequency values, are concentrated away from the origin. And following are the MSC value and PSNR value for the noise added image with respect to the original image. Butterworth low pass filter. So we will be only talking about Butterworth low pass filter because it was found to be the most efficient filter in the low pass category. And following is the Butterworth low pass filter mask, which we calculated using the formula. In this, we can see that the center is only the brighter part, and this mask, when applied to the Fourier transform of the noise added image using convolution theorem, only passes the low frequency value concentrated towards the origin. And below is the final output of the filtered image with the MSE and PSNR value of the following. Next, please. So here we can see in the left hand side a noise added image and the right hand side filtered image. Here the grainy texture has been completely smoothened out in the right hand side of the image, proving that the filter works successfully. Gaussian high pass filter. So this Gaussian high pass filter was found to be the most efficient filter in the high pass category. So above is the mask of the Gaussian high pass filter calculated through the formula. So the mask shows that the darker region in the center and the brighter region extending towards the corner. So when this mask is applied to the Fourier transform of the noise added image, all the low frequency value which is concentrated towards the origin would be cut off. Only high frequency values would be allowed through. And then we took the inverse transform to get the filtered image with the MSE value and PSNR value of the following. Next, please. So in this image, in this comparison, we can see that all the high frequency details such as outline have been exactly passed through, and we can see it in the right hand side of the Gaussian high pass filtered image, which proves that the filtering was successful. Following is a comparison table. In the second column, we have taken the MSE and PSNR value of the noise added image with respect to the original image, and we can see that the MSE value is very large compared to the rest of the MSE value of all the low pass filters, which proves that the low pass filtering works successfully. And also it can be found that it is to be noted 2 points. It is to be noted that these 2 points are very important. The lower the MSE value, the better is the quality of the image, and the higher the PSNR value, the better is the quality of the image. So in this, we can see that the Butterworth low pass filter has the least MSE value and the greatest PSNR value, proving it to be the most efficient filter in low pass category. And here we can see the same, that the Gaussian high pass filter has a least value in MSE and the greatest value in PSNR, making it the most efficient filter in high pass category. Next. So to conclude, as I said earlier, the MSE value and the PSNR value of the Butterworth low pass filter are least and the greatest, making it more efficient for filtering images. And in high pass category, the Gaussian high pass filter was the most efficient. Next, please. The other filters, we have also shown the ideal low pass filtered image, a Gaussian low pass filtered image. Next, ideal high pass filtered image, and Butterworth high pass filtered. So the application of low pass and high pass filters, we know that the low pass and high pass filter are a very important part of a digital image processing. So the low pass filter is used for smoothing of an image, while high pass image filter is used for sharpening of an image. So any area which uses digital images, for example, we can take astronomy, medical, there is a need for such filters. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
you. Okay. Now go for question answer. Keep your presentation shared. Don't remove it.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Prasad Modi, you can start.
Yeah, did you people develop code for these process?
Yes,
image processing,
yes,
or was there a standard code available?
No, sir. We have developed it ourselves. Here is the code. So, sir, essentially, it is the same type of code given for each and every filter and applied again and again. That's why it's that much lengthy.
Only the filtering part of the statements have to be changed, right?
Right. Not change. We have written it again and again. Change also we can do, but
change means the same code is repeated except those 3 lines, 4 lines, whatever are there that you replace.
Sir. Also, for low pass category, cutoff frequency was different, and high pass category cutoff frequency was different. So that part also, that parameter also we have changed.
What happens if you take same frequencies?
Nothing happens, sir, but the image quality, the cutoff frequency, we have decided by trial and error basis. So we have tried for number of values, and for the value which we are getting both qualitatively and quantitatively same result, that value we have chosen. We can keep it same, but in that, if we like for low pass, we have taken the cutoff frequency is 90. So this might not give good result in the case of high pass filters. In the high pass filters, cutoff frequency need to be a little high.
But you are taking 2 different algorithms, right? You are taking Gaussian for high pass and Butterworth for low pass.
No, sir. For low pass, we have seen all ideal, Butterworth, and Gaussian. And same for high pass, we have seen all ideal, Butterworth, and Gaussian. But here in PPT, we have included only 2 filters because among the low pass category, we found that Butterworth was the most efficient. And among the high pass category, we found that Gaussian was most efficient. That's why we showed only 2 in detail, and other only we flashed the mask and the images.
You have analyzed only this one image which you have shown, or have you analyzed more?
No, sir. Image this only, that alphabet A tile image, that only we have analyzed.
So how would you decide based on only one image?
Sir, for that particular image, we have seen all the filters. So
I know,
if we take another image, we can do it. If we take another image, then accordingly we have to change the cutoff frequency and all, in which all the details we are getting, that we would have to trial and error and see it.
Okay, so once you decided about one particular image, that will not straight away translate for another image.
No, sir, that would not happen in this code. We have to optimize the code and might use advanced technique for that.
Okay. Fine. Anvesh, go ahead.
In deciding which filter is good or better, did you have any quantitative criteria? That okay, if this feature is retained, then I will call it good, or if this feature is not retained, then I will call it good. Did you have such quantitative criteria, or it is just by visual inspection?
Yes, sir. We took the MSC and PSNR value as the threshold for deciding the efficiency of each filter. So the lower the MSC value, the better, the more efficient the filter is,
Right.
and the higher the
Now,
PSNR.
right. Now, if these things you have, then what sir was asking that if you have a different image, will these indices not be a reliable index for such images also?
So if we take a different image and correspondingly filter it, the maybe some other filter might prove efficient, sir. So we have taken only a basic image with a simple lower and high frequency Fourier transform.
Sir, I would like to add to it. Uh,
Yeah.
it may happen because this was during our project also that uh, MSC and PSNR value are not much reliable for all type of images. If we see, if we have a 8-bit images, it is giving nice result. But in that 8-bit image also, if the contrast is very low or the contrast is very high, these two values might not give proper result. That we haven't checked for it, but from theoretical background I can say so.
Okay. Yeah. At the end, just a comment. I mean, you showed and you yourself said that your code is long because you have repetition of lines. Why did you do that? That's not a very good way to code, right? You'd rather make it modular and just call appropriate functions to change the operative part, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yes,
Hey,
sir.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I hope you appreciate that. So because you yourself
Yes.
commented that.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tana. Let's go on to the next presentation, which is the last presentation of today. So now invite TYBSC Group 18, Avalon, Bego, and Dipanshu Gurjar. Can you please share your screens?
Yes, sir, we will. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So,
Start,
good
your
afternoon,
time
everyone.
starts now.
Sorry.
Your time starts now.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dipanshu Gurjar, and my partner.
I'm Avlon Regu.
Yeah. So our project is on a Brownian motion of milk particle. So basically, let's just see what Brownian motion is. Basically, Brownian motion is the zigzag random motion of particle, which comes out as a result of the bombardment from the surrounding particle of the medium. So let's quickly go to the theory part. Okay. So if you consider a sample, sorry. Okay, so if you consider a sample, if you consider these circles as the particles, then if you consider a smaller area inside that, then the probability that a particle chosen at random will be inside that box will be given by the volume of the smaller box divided by the volume of the entire sample. And of course, the probability of not finding inside that region will be 1 minus p. Now, so the probability that n particle chosen at random will be inside this box will be given by binomial distribution. And then if you do a little bit of mathematics, then if these numbers of particle tends to infinity, then we know the binomial distribution tends to a Poisson distribution. So this is a bit of math, but so this the probability of finding n particle inside a volume V, this follows a Poisson distribution. Here the nu is the volume of the smaller region considered, and n is the number of particles. Now, knowing this, we can derive a relationship between the probability P and the mean fluctuation of the particles inside that area. That is given by this equation. Now, just to put it out there, this entire theory has been explained in a paper which we taken as a reference due to the experiment. Okay, so here delta is the fluctuation. So the mean fluctuation is equal to 2 times average number of particles times the probability P, which has been explained earlier. So now this P is related to D, and how D, which is the diffusion coefficient. So let's see how it's that. So if you consider Q, R, T, the probability of particle being at R at a time T, then you can write it like this, where it's the 4 position around that particle from where it can come to the position RT at time T. Now, if you subtract QRT minus 2, there is a mistake, QRT minus 2 from the above equation, then you get the following expression. If you define a square by 4 tau as D, then you can write it as a differential equation. It's like this. This is the differential equation of Brownian motion. Now, if you use the Fourier transform, then the operating on it, then the probability is given by the following expression, and then you can put at time t equals to 0. Then, if you took R2 as the position at later time and R1 as the initial position, then it can be written like this. And then, if you want to find the probability that a particle which is inside that considered region comes out of it after time tau, then it can be written like an integral where R1 is inside the volume and R2 is outside that particular region. The probability that a particle will remain in that region will be given by 1 minus P, and changing the variable R1 and R2 belong to the region which we have considered. Now, if you convert them to the X and Y coordinate, it resulted to the following equation. And finally, we can write the relationship between P and D as this. Here, D is the diffusion coefficient, tau is the time period of the observation. D is, of course, probability, H is the dimension of the area considered. Now, I want to explain the rest of the project.
Okay, so we come back to the experimental setup. So what we did was we took 0.5 ml of pasteurized milk and 5 ml of water, and then we transferred it to a pasteur pipette, and then we put it under a microscope and took a video of it using a 64 megapixel camera. So using this, we got a video for the experiment, and then using a small Python script, we extracted the frames for all the we extracted the frames, and we got every image, and from that we then use various image processing programs. So in the end, we decided that the best would be ImageJ, and using ImageJ, we took a small
extracted,
extracted the small sample within it of 1000 cross 1000 pixels, which starts from 1000,500. So the actual size of this the actual size of the sample would be 57.91 micrometers. A side of it would be that, so the square of the area considered would be the square of that. So we convert it to an 8-bit image, and then we use unsharp masking and put a weightage of 0.6. So this basically gets rid of all the noise in the image, and then we put a threshold on the brightness. So no pixel with a brightness of less than 300 and 235 would be visible. That's why in the second image you can see it's basically all black with certain particles. Then on top of this, we filtered out based on size and circularity. So the size of the particle is 15 and the circularity is 0.8. And putting all these filters on it, we get the next image you see here. So this is the final result. The right is your original sample, and the left is after we put all the sample filters on it. So we can basically automate this with a functionality in ImageJ, which allows you to automate the process for every image. So once you have decided on your parameters, you can automatically get all the frames you have extracted and get the number of particles in automatically. So we did that, and this is the fluctuation, the number of particles with time, and the mean value is around 305. So from that, we calculated that our probability was equal to. Wait, sorry.
Wait. So
Okay, yeah.
this is the distribution which we found, the number of particles observed, and the number of particles on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have frequency of observation. So you can see it does follow a Poisson distribution. Evelyn, continue.
Yes. Yeah. So from that, we found the probability of our probability which we are supposed to get was equal to 0.347, and 1 minus that, the root of 1 minus that would be equal to 0.808. And since we couldn't solve the integral we had earlier solved exactly, we just had to use basically guess at the values for d, and using those, the guess for which we got it equal to the root of 1 minus p, we get the best value. And from that, we found that the diffusion constant was equal to 1.94 2 into 10 raised to minus 11 meters square per second. And yeah, so these have some applications in medicine, like we would need to know how it diffuses in blood, or we can see how gaseous contaminants move in like hospitals and stuff. And even chemical industries that will have use for the diffusion constant in which they are considering. We also considered further work we can do on this. So we had basically taken this video before our fourth sem, and did this project in our fifth sem. So we hadn't had this particular project in mind, so we could and take a video more tailored to our needs right now. And we could use distilled water, which was as you'll see, there are impurities in the sample.
Okay, so you can see the circles which these circles image, probably you won't be able to see. So here these are the particles which you can see. On the right side you can see the what original is and what has been detected by the software. So you can see that it's not actually the milk particle, but an impurity particle, and there are some white. It could be a particle, or it's just a light affecting around it. So it has been considered as a particle. So that brings in some error. So we can use an improved algorithm to detect such particles. And this theory was Smolsky, if I'm pronouncing it right, theory of density fluctuation. And there's another way to calculate the diffusion coefficient using Einstein's method. So we want to compare these two methods experimentally and using simulations as well. Yeah, so thank you. That was project.
Thank you.
Okay, we open up for the question answer now.
Yeah, you found some value of the diffusion coefficient, right?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Did you compare it with some other measured values?
Actually, the theory which we, like the paper which we referred to, they had calculated the value. The order was 10 to the power minus 12. We are getting here is minus 11.
Also, the experiment is dependent on things like pressure, temperature, and various other like impurities and other things. So it was expected that we wouldn't get a very exact value for all this, and would have some fluctuations. So it is a good result despite all the flaws in the experiment.
Yeah, that's all right. I was not questioning the goodness of your result. I was just asking whether you have compared it.
Yeah,
That's all.
so it is in the order of magnitude of what results you've seen online.
Yeah.
I'll just take this same point. Since you say that variation of pressure and temperature, so if you have referred to some value in literature, they must have mentioned the temperature and pressure, and then you must have the values for yourself also. So did you see the comparison? I guess is that pressure, of course, it's a liquid, so it won't make too much of a difference, assuming all will be around atmospheric pressure. And if what they mention in literature is also under laboratory conditions, the variation in temperature also play a big role. Did you pay attention to those values?
No, I think the experimentation which was done in the paper, it was also done in the room temperature and the normal pressure. So I think we refer to that value only.
Okay, so the paper which we had referred to was the experiment was done in 2007. So the experiment basically was done by eye. They didn't have the software here, so that is basically what our thing was. Key. We used more modern techniques. So basically, we used image analysis to make it easier on us and more accurate, basically. So even when they had done it, the paper which we referred to didn't mention any pressure temperatures, and there are references which also we looked into. In that, the references just gave us the theory. It didn't tell us much about the temperature pressure conditions. So we didn't know how exactly it would vary much with that. We know there will be some effect, but we are not exactly 100% sure what the effects will be.
I mean, the kind of variation would be there in their lab and your lab would create significant change in the value. It may be just a second or third
Yeah, but they
decimal
did
place.
by eye. So it's possible that they missed many particles because it's kind of difficult to just look at a microscope and do the.
No, actually, that's not the only thing. What they did was they manually calculated it. And since, like as I showed you, there were some particles which we detected, which are not actually the particles, but there are some impurities, and yeah, so that brings in the error. So that could be the reason why our values vary from theirs.
Okay. Okay. Since you have referred to only one literature, we don't know much. So
yeah.
Okay. Fine.
So you have counted the number of particles, right? If I understood you correctly.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So the that is through the image processing software. Am I right?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So so the entire thing is taken as one cell, and you are counting the number of particles within that cell. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly. So from the original, the entire sample, we have cropped a part from it, and we have calculated the number of particles inside that part.
Yeah. So do you think it might be possible to have more number of such cells or boxes? And because obviously this will have some fluctuations, and so if you do it over a large number of boxes, perhaps some of these things will be averaged out, some of these effects, like the effects that you are talking of, impurities and all. If you have instead of one cell or one box, if you have it in, if you count in, let's say 16 boxes and then average over that, those effects will obviously, I mean, get averaged out, right?
Yeah, right.
Would average out, but there would still be an effect because we assume that the impurities were either in the milk or in the water. So either way, it would have a constant presence in our sample. So it's not like there'll be a significant difference. We are assuming it is basically equally dispersed in everything, right? So the averaging out effect might not be as significant as you imagine, probably.
Okay. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so with this, we finish this session of ProWell. I would request all of you to give a big round of applause for all the presenters for this session. Kindly unmute yourself. Thank you. We will meet again on the same link.